Elon Musk? Really? One of the TV hosts chuckled sarcastically, turning to her co-anchor. He's more likely to hire Barron Trump as his next spokesperson than the kid actually achieving something on his own. The studio audience laughed, a ripple of uncomfortable amusement that hung in the air like a bad smell. The words hit like a hammer, not just to those watching at home, but to Melania Trump, who sat frozen in her sunlit Florida living room. Her phone buzzed incessantly with messages, each notification delivering another jab of fury. The insult wasn't just careless, it was cruel. She replayed the clip, the words ringing louder each time. Melania's face tightened, her usual calm replaced by a rare display of raw emotion. The insult wasn't about some political rivalry or her public persona. This time, it was personal. It was about Barron, her 18-year-old son who had always been the quiet one, the one shielded from the chaos of public life. Within minutes, the clip had gone viral. Social media erupted, with hashtags like #RespectBarron and #ShameOnThem trending worldwide. Even Elon Musk himself chimed in, tweeting, "Barron Trump is a young man with immense potential. Mocking him reflects poorly on those who do it. Not on him. Unacceptable." The tweet alone garnered millions of likes, but it was Melania's silence that became the focal point of speculation. What would she do? The answer came quickly. Melania slammed her laptop shut and paced across the room. Her heels clicked sharply against the marble floor, each step echoing her growing resolve. "Enough is enough," she murmured, her accent sharpening the edges of her words. For years she had endured countless attacks on her character, her marriage, and her decisions. But this, targeting her child, her only son, was beyond the pale. She called her lawyer. "They went too far," Melania said, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and conviction. "I want to take action. I don't care what it takes." Her attorney, a seasoned litigator with a reputation for taking on high-profile cases, paused. "Melania," she said carefully, "this will be a war. The media will dig into everything. Are you ready for that?" Melania's response was immediate. "I am his mother. I will not stand by and let this go unanswered." That evening, Melania sat down with Barron. He looked up from his book, his tall frame slightly hunched, a sign of how uncomfortable he felt under the relentless gaze of public scrutiny. "They said things about me again, didn't they?" Barron asked quietly, his blue eyes clouded with a mix of sadness and resignation. Melania reached out, placing a hand over his. "Yes, they did, and I will not let them. You are strong, Barron. You are better than their words." The determination in her voice struck something deep within Barron. For the first time, he saw not just his mother, but a warrior, a protector willing to fight for his dignity. As the sun set over Mar-a-Lago, the stage was set. Melania Trump wasn't just a former First Lady. She was a mother on a mission, and the world was about to witness her fight like never before. The room was quiet, save for the faint rustling of palm trees outside the grand windows of Mar-a-Lago. Inside, the tension was thick. Melania Trump stood at the center of her private study, her phone clenched tightly in her hand. Around her sat a group of advisors, all waiting for her to speak. At the head of the table was her attorney, Catherine Moore, known in legal circles as the Iron Lady. Catherine leaned forward, her sharp eyes scanning the room. "Melania, this isn't just about a cheap insult. If we proceed, this will turn into a public spectacle. The media will come at you and Barron harder than ever." Melania looked up, her usually composed demeanor replaced by raw emotion. "Spectacle? What they did to my son was humiliation," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "Barron has been mocked for years, but this crossed a line. I will not let them destroy him for a laugh." As the conversation unfolded, the door opened quietly. Donald Trump entered, his usual bravado softened by the weight of the moment. He walked over to Melania and placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Are you sure about this?" he asked, his voice unusually gentle. She turned to face him, her eyes welling up. "Donald, they've pushed him too far. Do you know what Barron said to me last night?" Donald raised an eyebrow, waiting. "He asked me why people hate him so much," she said, her voice breaking. "Our son, the boy who has done nothing to deserve this. How can I look into his eyes and tell him it's okay to let them win?" Donald's face hardened, his protective instincts as a father shining through. "Then you fight," he said, nodding toward Catherine, "and we make sure they regret ever saying his name." Catherine took the cue, opening her briefcase with a decisive snap. "Here's what we're looking at. Defamation, emotional distress. We go for both," she said, laying out a detailed plan. "But this won't just be a legal battle. It'll be a war in the court of public opinion. We'll need evidence, witnesses, and a strong narrative." Melania didn't hesitate. "Then start now. I'll give you everything you need. Catherine paused, looking directly at Melania. And Barron? We'll need to prepare him too. This trial will put him in the spotlight like never before. A flashback crossed Melania's mind. Barron, barely 10 years old, holding her hand tightly as photographers screamed his name during a public appearance. He had looked up at her with wide, frightened eyes. She had promised him then that she would always protect him. I will prepare him, she said, her voice steady. He is stronger than they think. The meeting ended, but the decision had already ignited something deep within Melania. That night, she sat down with Barron once more. We are going to fight this, she told him. Not just for you, but for every child who has ever been bullied by people who think they are untouchable. Barron hesitated, then nodded. I trust you, Mom, he said softly. As the moonlight poured into the room, Melania's resolve solidified. This wasn't just a lawsuit. It was a stand, a mother's stand against the cruelty of the world. And she wasn't going to back down. The courtroom was a swirl of tension, its air thick with murmurs and the clicking of camera shutters from the gallery. Rows of reporters filled the benches, their pens poised to capture the trial's every detail. At the center of it all sat Melania Trump, her posture regal, her expression unyielding. Next to her sat Barron, his shoulders squared but his face betraying traces of unease. Across the room, the defendants, the two TV hosts, appeared surprisingly smug. Their legal team exchanged whispers, confident in their argument that the remarks were mere satire. But the mood shifted the moment Catherine Moore, Melania's lead attorney, stood up to deliver her opening statement. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Catherine began, her voice calm but firm. Today, we are not just discussing words. We are discussing the power of words, their ability to harm, to ridicule, and to destroy the spirit of a child who never asked for the public stage. As Catherine spoke, she gestured toward Barron, who sat quietly, his gaze fixed on the floor. Barron Trump did not choose to be in the spotlight. He did not choose to become the punchline of a cruel joke. And yet, here we are, fighting to remind the world that even the most public of families deserve privacy and respect for their children. The words landed heavily in the room, silencing even the skeptical whispers of the opposing counsel. The defense attorneys quickly rose to counter. This case, one of them argued, is about freedom of expression. The remarks in question were made in jest, in a comedic segment. They were not intended to cause harm. The courtroom seemed to shift as Catherine rose again, this time with a folder in her hand. Intent does not erase impact, she said, her voice slicing through the defense's arguments. And to illustrate the impact, I would like to introduce evidence. And the room held its breath as Catherine opened the folder and read aloud from what she explained were fictionalized diary entries written by Barron. I don't understand why they hate me, she read, her voice soft but steady. I try to stay quiet, out of the way, but no matter what I do, they laugh at me. They say I'm not good enough. Sometimes I wonder if I'll ever be. A hush fell over the courtroom. Reporters lowered their pens. Even the jury shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their eyes darting toward Barron, who now stared intently at his hands. Melania reached over and placed a comforting hand on her son's arm. It was a small gesture, but it spoke volumes. To her, this wasn't just about winning. It was about showing Barron that he was worth fighting for. As the day's proceedings continued, it became clear that this wasn't just a legal battle. It was a fight for dignity, for accountability, and for a mother's unwavering love. The stakes were higher than ever, and the world was watching. As the trial unfolded, the outside world became an inferno of emotions. Snippets from the courtroom began flooding social media. Catherine Moore's piercing arguments, Barron's poignant struggle, and even Melania's silent but powerful presence in court. Within hours, hashtags like #Justice for Barron and #Protect Our Children began trending globally, carrying with them a wave of indignation. One clip, in particular, ignited a firestorm. Catherine, addressing the jury, stated, "This case is not just about one family. It's about every child who has ever been mocked, bullied, or ridiculed for simply existing." That single line spread like wildfire, capturing hearts across the globe. Parents shared stories of their children's struggles. Celebrities lent their voices to the cause, and advocacy groups rallied behind Melania's fight for accountability. Amid the chaos, a single letter emerged that changed everything. It was from a 12-year-old girl named Emily, whose handwritten note went viral after her mother shared it online. Dear Barron, I saw what those people said about you on TV. People say mean things about me too because I'm different. It hurts a lot, but seeing your mom fight for you makes me believe my mom would fight for me too. I hope you win because maybe then people will stop hurting kids like us. The letter was simple, yet it carried an emotional weight that resonated deeply. News outlets picked it up, and the courtroom itself felt the impact when Catherine read it aloud during the next session. Barron, seated beside his mother, blinked back tears as he listened, his face softening with a mix of gratitude and sadness. Melania reached over and gave his hand a gentle squeeze, her silent promise as steadfast as ever. The tide was turning swiftly. Public opinion shifted from outrage to action. Prominent figures like Oprah, Taylor Swift, and even advocacy groups like UNICEF weighed in, demanding an end to media exploitation of children. "This isn't about politics," one tweet read. "This is about basic human decency." On the other side, the TV hosts found themselves in hot water. Sponsors began pulling their advertisements, distancing themselves from the controversy. One major corporation issued a statement: "We cannot support content that ridicules or harms individuals, especially children." Their fall from grace was as public as their offense, with their faces plastered across headlines not as entertainers, but as cautionary tales. Meanwhile, in court, the parallels between Barron's experience and others began to emerge. Catherine highlighted past moments where the media crossed the line, children of other public figures dragged into controversies they had no part in. The jury seemed visibly moved as footage played of similar incidents, drawing uncomfortable gasps from the gallery. Melania's fight was no longer just a legal battle. It had become a movement. Barron, once the silent figure in the background, now symbolized every child who had ever been hurt by a world that should have protected them. But as the momentum grew, so did the stakes. The media machine began pushing back, trying to spin the narrative of censorship and free speech. The courtroom, once a stage for legal arguments, now represented the clash of two worlds, one demanding accountability and another clinging to its power. The courtroom was abuzz with whispers, the tension almost unbearable as Catherine Moore walked back to her table after delivering another powerful argument. The jury appeared engrossed, their eyes betraying hints of empathy for Melania and Barron. But as compelling as their case had been, the defense still clung to their narrative. The remarks were offhand jokes never meant to cause harm. Melania sat motionless, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Barron glanced at her, a flicker of doubt crossing his face. She leaned toward him and whispered, "Trust me, Barron. We're not done yet." Her words carried more conviction than the rising murmur of the crowd. Just then, the courtroom doors creaked open. A man in his late 30s entered, his face pale and drawn. He walked nervously to Catherine and whispered something that made her freeze mid-motion. She quickly scribbled a note and passed it to the judge. "Your Honor," Catherine said, her voice steady but with an edge of urgency, "we would like to call a surprise witness to the stand." The courtroom erupted into gasps and whispers as the judge nodded cautiously. "Proceed." The man took the stand, introducing himself as Richard Carter, a mid-level producer at the network behind the controversial TV segment. His hands trembled as he adjusted the microphone. "What do you have to share with the court today, Mr. Carter?" Catherine asked, her tone sharp but encouraging. Richard hesitated, then took a deep breath. "I have proof that the remarks about Barron Trump were not spontaneous. They were scripted." The courtroom went silent, a collective gasp echoing through the air. Melania straightened in her seat, her eyes narrowing on the witness. Catherine stepped forward, presenting a folder to the judge. "These are internal emails from the production team," Catherine announced. "They show discussions about how to mock Barron Trump during the segment. The producers specifically targeted him because, and I quote, 'he's an easy hit.'" As the emails were read aloud, the courtroom transformed. The smug expressions of the defendants disappeared, replaced by visible panic. The jury shifted uncomfortably, some shaking their heads in disbelief. The gallery erupted into chaos, reporters furiously typing the breaking news. The emails were damning. They outlined premeditated discussions about Barron, referencing his quiet demeanor as low-hanging fruit. One producer even joked, "Let's see if the Trumps can handle a little heat." Melania's face was unreadable, but her hand tightened on Barron's. He glanced at her, his expression conflicted. For the first time, he seemed to understand the depth of what his mother was fighting for. The defense scrambled to regain control, claiming the emails were taken out of context, but the damage was done. The defendant's credibility was shattered, their carefully constructed defense in tatters. Melania's eyes locked with Catherine's. No words were exchanged, but the silent nod between them said it all. This was the breakthrough they needed. As the court adjourned for the day, the media frenzy outside reached a fever pitch. Richard Carter was escorted out under heavy security, his testimony already making headlines. Inside the courtroom, Melania turned to Barron. "Do you see now?" she asked softly. "This isn't just about words. It's about standing up when no one else will." Barron nodded, his voice barely a whisper. "I see it now, Mom. Thank you." The courtroom was suffocatingly still, the kind of silence that makes every breath feel loud and every heartbeat like a drum. All eyes were on the jury as they filed back into their seats, their expressions guarded. The weight of their decision was palpable, and even the most seasoned reporters in the gallery sat frozen, pens poised but unmoving. At the plaintiff's table, Melania Trump sat straight-backed, her face a mask of composure. Barron, beside her, fidgeted slightly, his hands clasped so tightly his knuckles turned white. She placed a steadying hand over his, and though she didn't speak, the gesture conveyed everything. "We've done all we can. Now we wait." The judge cleared his throat, his voice breaking the tension like a knife slicing through ice. "Members of the jury, have you reached a verdict?" "We have, Your Honor," the foreperson said, her voice trembling ever so slightly. As the verdict form was handed to the judge, Catherine Moore leaned in toward Melania, her voice barely a whisper. "No matter what happens, you've made a difference. The world is watching." Melania gave a small nod, her eyes fixed on the judge as he unfolded the paper. "In the matter of Trump versus Global Media Network, we find in favor of the plaintiff." The words hung in the air for a moment, before the reality of them sank in. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. A few reporters bolted for the doors, eager to be the first to break the story. Melania exhaled slowly, the tension visibly leaving her body. Beside her, Barron blinked, his eyes widening as if he hadn't dared to hope for this outcome. The judge continued. "The defendants are ordered to pay $50 million in damages to the plaintiff for defamation and emotional distress." The figure sent a shockwave through the room. The defendants slumped in their seats, their earlier confidence replaced with pale, hollow expressions. They knew their careers and their reputations were irreparably damaged. Melania stood as the judge thanked the jury and adjourned the court. All eyes turned to her, waiting for a reaction, but it wasn't until the reporters shouted questions that she raised her hand to signal for silence. She stepped forward, her voice steady, but charged with emotion. "This case was never about money," she began, her gaze sweeping the room. "It was about dignity, about respect, about reminding the world that children, no matter who their parents are, deserve to be protected from harm, not used as pawns or jokes." Her words carried the weight of the past weeks, the relentless pressure, and the pain she had fought through for her son. This verdict is not just a victory for Barron. It is a victory for every child who has ever been hurt by the careless words of others. Let this be a reminder. Words have power. Use them wisely. Barron stood quietly at her side, his eyes fixed on the ground. As Melania finished her statement and turned to him, he looked up, his expression a mix of relief and gratitude. "Thank you, Mom," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. She wrapped an arm around his shoulder, pulling him close. For a moment, it was just the two of them, a mother and son who had weathered the storm together. The cameras captured the moment, but no headline could capture the depth of what it meant to them. As they exited the courtroom, Melania's mind was already turning to the future. This was a battle won, but it was part of a larger war. A war to reshape how the media treated the vulnerable. She knew this victory had sent a message, but the question lingered. Would the world listen? The world outside the courthouse was alive with a frenzy of reporters, flashing cameras, and the hum of a crowd that had gathered to witness history. For Melania Trump and Barron, stepping out into the blinding light felt like emerging from a storm. But this time, they weren't alone. A sea of supporters cheered from behind the barricades, holding signs that read, "Protect our kids," and "Justice for Barron." Melania paused at the top of the courthouse steps, her hand resting lightly on Barron's shoulder. He stood taller now, his frame still youthful but carrying a new strength. For the first time in a long time, his face bore the faint trace of a smile. The media fallout from the verdict was immediate and explosive. News channels that had once casually joked about public figures' children scrambled to issue statements. Policies were drafted overnight, introducing stricter guidelines for how networks handled coverage of minors. Talk shows debated the broader implications of the case, and many hosts admitted on air that they'd never considered the emotional toll their words might take. But the most impactful shift came from everyday people. Parents around the world began sharing their own stories of fighting for their children against bullies, institutions, and even societal norms. Melania's stand had struck a nerve, inspiring a movement that transcended politics and privilege. In the quiet sanctuary of Mar-a-Lago, the atmosphere was vastly different. The tension that had gripped the house for weeks was gone, replaced by an air of relief and reflection. Melania sat with Barron in the garden, the Florida sun casting a warm glow over the manicured hedges. "Do you feel different?" she asked gently, her gaze fixed on her son. Barron hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, I do." He glanced down at his hands, his voice growing softer. "It's not just about what they said, it's how I felt about myself. Like maybe they were right." Melania's heart ached at his words. She reached for his hand, her touch firm but comforting. "Barron, you are strong. You always have been. But the world will try to make you doubt that. Don't let it." He looked up at her, his eyes shining with a mix of gratitude and newfound confidence. "I didn't understand why you fought so hard, but now, I do. Thank you, Mom, for everything." Their moment was interrupted by the sound of a phone buzzing. Melania glanced at the screen. Another parent's message of thanks, one of hundreds she'd received in the past 24 hours. She set the phone aside, choosing instead to focus on the moment with her son. As they sat together, a sense of peace settled over them. The fight had been grueling, but it had been worth it, not just for the verdict, but for the bond it had strengthened between them. Elsewhere, the conversation about media responsibility continued. Some doubted the case would create lasting change, claiming the industry was too entrenched in its ways. But others saw it as a turning point, a reminder that even the most powerful institutions could be held accountable. Melania, however, wasn't dwelling on that now. For her, the victory wasn't about money or headlines. It was about showing her son and the world that dignity and respect were worth fighting for. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the garden in shades of gold and pink, Melania turned to Barron with a quiet smile. "This is just the beginning," she said softly. He nodded, a determined light in his eyes. "I know. Final suspense." Would this moment mark the start of a broader cultural shift, or was it merely a fleeting victory in an ongoing battle for decency? Only time would tell. This story is more than a courtroom drama. It's a wake-up call for all of us. Words have power, and how we choose to use them can shape lives, for better or worse. Let this landmark case inspire us to reflect on our own actions and stand up for what's right. If this story moved you, take a moment to share it with someone who needs to hear it. Join the conversation by leaving your thoughts in the comments. How can we create a world where respect and empathy prevail?